James felt every hair in his body stand up as the sun jerked slightly under his feet. Meanwhile, the previous UFO alert had been replaced by a full-on hostile ships alert. What the hell was going on out there? A few moments later, the door to the safe room opened, a large group of people waiting on the other side. It seemed that the active alert really had kicked the securing of all non-essential personnel into high gear. James stood back and watched quietly as people flooded in, taking passive notice of the people themselves. Medical personnel and people from MedEng took up a large portion of them, and they all walked in a practiced and orderly fashion. Drills for this sort of situation were not an uncommon thing on board of a military ship like this, so even though this was under much more serious conditions, the endless repetition of what to do in such a situation kept people calm and in their roles, so to speak. After the first large group of people had passed the doors and moved to the far side of the room, there was a second group still waiting outside, which now began the process of gradually pushing medical beds into the promised safety. Luckily, the Sun's intensive care units weren't exactly full to the brim at the time, meaning there were just 3 patients currently sick enough that they required their beds and some machinery to be brought along with them in this part of the ship. James's very own former surgeon, Dr. Schramm, was next to one of them, currently monitoring a dark-haired patient who, by the look of things, appeared to be recovering from the recent attaching of a prosthetic hand. Another one appeared to be a nervous-looking young mother, whose hair was sticky with sweat that also covered her entire face, as she did her best to hide any nervousness while holding a tightly bundled-up newborn against her chest, gently bouncing it with one arm while tightly clutching the hand of an outer uniformed soldier, who James recognized from a few very brief meetings with the other. And of course, the third one. James rushed up to the bed, positioning himself next to Tuya, who was currently helping the medical personnel push Nia into the room, while a female doctor with long blonde but already greying hair seemingly monitored her patient with the medical devices that were still attached to James's unconscious sister. "Is everything alright?" he asked nervously, doing his best to stay out of the way, even though he really wanted to get right next to her. "Your sister is stable, Lieutenant Aldwin," the doctor confirmed for him without delay. "Luckily, she started breathing on her own again a few hours ago, so the ventilator is simply a precaution now. If she continues to take to the treatment as she did, she should wake up in the near future." James released a shaky breath that was nonetheless filled with relief at the fact that Nia appeared to be in no mortal danger from needing to be moved. Tuya gave James a brief, encouraging smile before pushing the bed onward together with some nurses, quickly making sure that their patients wouldn't take up too much of the safe room space. Forming the anchor behind the hard-to-move beds, a last group comprised of soldiers finally entered the room as well. They were mostly ground troops who, much like James, wouldn't be of much direct use in a confrontation between ships, meaning that they were instead stationed within the safe rooms, in order to guard those inside in case they would need protection for any reason, after the worst possibly occurred. However, in this case, a few not quite fit-for-duty figures were among them as well, some of them dragging themselves into the room with as much of a problem standing up with their own strength as James had. Coco especially seemed to be entirely out of it, and had to fully rely on Andres to hold her upright as James's entire team was feeling the after-effects of the previous night. Well, almost James's entire team. "Where?" he said, as he walked up to them, glancing over the group a couple of times to make sure he didn't miss anyone, as a queasy feeling rose up in his stomach. "Where is Shida?" Among all of the many, many humans that had entered the room together to find relative safety, there wasn't a Miette in sight. "Where?" James tried to ask again, before the gaze of Athena suddenly hit him, her icy blue eyes boring into his. "Went to the hangar," she said. And although she was definitely feeling the effects of the alcohol, the captain's voice had a severity to it that James only knew from their past missions together. "She's got a job to do." In all honesty, she might as well have shot right through him with one of her rifles, as James stood there turning paler and paler, as all blood rushed right out of his face. They travelled around together so much, and were usually so close to each other, that it was quite easy to forget, but Shida wasn't like him. She wasn't some planet-side grunt, she was Lieutenant Commander. Unlike him, she knew damn well how to fly a ship, and she was more than capable of holding her own in the space battle. Well, at least James had to assume so. It wasn't like he had ever seen her truly in action. And unlike the rest of the team, she couldn't have alcohol either, meaning as the only one of them, she was stone sober when the alarm blared. His eyes twitched over to Coco for a moment. Usually she'd be out there with her. Not only that, but as commander, she would coordinate a large number of the ships out there. But now, she could barely stand. She could barely stand because she and James had decided to make the evening count. And make it count they did. And now, she was completely down for the count. "Whoa there!" one of the uniformed soldiers announced as James suddenly felt two strong arms reaching under his armpits, catching him and holding him in place. He hadn't even noticed himself tipping over. His legs had just lost their strength all of a sudden. "This can't be," he mumbled, but couldn't even get the whole sentence out as the world suddenly began spinning around him again. So far, the adrenaline, as well as other chemicals, both natural and not, had done quite well at warding off the effects of his intoxication, and had kept him going for a bit. But now, all at once, he suddenly only felt how his stomach churned. "Destruction of 11 enemy ships confirmed," a middle-aged Zodiatos trumpeted in jubilation, thrusting her trunk up into a Y shape, as she lifted her head up so quickly that she almost reared up onto her hind legs for a moment. "The systems of one more are heavily damaged, leaving it incapacitated." Nafmir Duralfren closed his eyes for a moment. Unlike his inferior, he didn't cheer or even so much as smile. With his eyes closed, he held his breath, while slowly lifting his split trunk over his shoulder. Using its end that had half of it missing, he slowly glided along the scar on the right side of his body, following the ridge of bumpy, callous skin all the way from his brow down to his back, until he could reach no further. Even after many years of having it, the sensation of injured flesh rubbing against injured flesh never felt quite right, and yet the feeling somehow grounded him, kept him in the moment, gave him a feeling of purpose. "The human ship?" he then finally asked, using the sentence to release the breath that he had been holding in a slow and controlled manner. They must have been prepared for an attack. Their hyperspace generators had been ready for a jump. They likely prepared it long before the shots were fired. "Made a very short jump." The answer to his question came not even a second later from another one of his officers. "Re-emerged immediately around a light second away." A light second jump? Maybe they weren't as prepared as he thought. They must have barely gotten the generators fired up enough for travel. "Immediately fire more order guards in their direction," he ordered. "We cannot allow them a clean shot with their weaponry." "Yes, sir," his gunner replied with eagerness. The young bull was a good bit smaller than Nafmir Duralfren, and nowhere near as well built. However, he certainly didn't lack in motivation, as he used his terminal to fire at the newly repositioned enemy. He had already given his other ships the order to fire in the direction of the other two human combatants, even as they remained too far away to actually be threatened by the order guards. A direct hit from one of their FTL weapons would spell an almost certain end for one of his ships, so he had to make sure to keep obstacles between them at all times. "Once those rounds are out, remove the remaining Quavery," Nafmir Duralfren then added onto his orders. His fellow core worlders were by far the lower threat, and could be taken out with conventional weaponry, as long as the order guards provided cover for his own ships. Hopefully, they would realize they were outmatched and would use this brief grace period that he granted them to mount their escape. Killing them was a shame, truly, but he had his orders, and he would fulfill them to his last breath if he had to. "Be smart and fall back," he thought to himself, as he looked at the pristine white ships that hadn't been turned into scrap yet. With 11 ships destroyed and 1 out of commission, the Quavery may have technically still outnumbered his own little attack fleet, but still, they had to realize they stood no chance. There was no need for them to die a senseless death here. Although, of course, they didn't know that. Surely their hearts burnt with the same sense of duty as his did, as they simply had to assume that their home was under attack, and that they were the only ones who could yet defend it. How much he wished that he could have told them otherwise. Nafmir Duralfriend lowered his gaze slightly, as his ears began to flap. As always, the slits splitting his right ear in two caused some mild pulling pain whenever it moved a bit too fast, but he was so used to it that he barely noticed. Still, it reminded him of how he had gotten it.
"Just like old times, old friend,"
he quietly mumbled to himself, thinking of the good lives that would be tragically and senselessly lost.
"Travel-sized hyperspace stretches detected,"
one of his officers yelled out, pulling him out of his melancholic yet nostalgia-filled thoughts.
"They are jumping again,"
he wondered, looking up to the screen. Were they already dodging? Probably. They had seen how destructive these weapons could be. However, stretches, plural, implied the other ships were moving as well. They were too far away to be afraid of the incoming fire. Maybe a strategic repositioning?
"Keep up the fire on the flagship's new position,"
he ordered first, to make sure his gunner wouldn't forget to keep their cover up. Then he turned his attention to the currently more strategically important targets.
"Where have the cruisers moved? Are they closer?"
As he asked, his eyes already moved over to the screen before him to confirm their position for himself. However, as they fell upon it, they found that the readings they saw there were quite confounding.
"Negative, sir. None of the ships have moved from their position," his officer shouted.
All the while, his eyes retreated to the side of the indicators for large hyperspace stretches, rising and falling on his screen, jumping up and down like a frequency, or like a heartbeat. The activity was so large and constant that it was hard for the sensors to even pin down how many stretches were being generated and where they emerged. Space was stretched and pulled constantly like a deflated balloon in the hands of a toddler, not truly allowed to fully settle for even a moment as stretch after stretch tugged at its integrity. Feeling his eyes widen, he exhaled slowly, and once again ran his permanently injured trunk over his scar.
"All ships, fire a protective volley immediately," he then ordered.
He didn't know what was going on, but he wasn't going to take any chances with it. They were going to completely protect themselves while they figured it out. There was no way he was going to let himself be blindsided while he thought. All gunners complied immediately, and soon enough the ship vibrated ever so slightly as it shot out the massive projectile that, along with its brethren, soon formed the protective bubble of destructive energy around his forces.
"Visuals,"
he then asked, causing the officer to switch her attention to a different window on her terminal.
"Should be reaching us any second, sir,"
she then finally replied.
"I'm putting it through to you."
Nafmir Duralfriend nodded and lifted his gaze. Viewed on a screen through the feed of a camera, void sickness was luckily a much smaller problem, especially for someone as experienced as he was, as he looked upon the video broadcast of the black human ship hovering in space. To say that he saw the ship would have been an overstatement. It was so dark that any direct features were nigh impossible to make out. The only reason it was somewhat visible at all was that it blocked enough light to become perceivable, as a dark shadow pushing itself through space. Soon enough, the hazy energy around the order guards was already taking away his vision again as it built up, but not before he saw what had happened that had caused his senses to become so overloaded with input. Bright sparks came from the human ship, lighting up its dark shape against the empty space, briefly making its form appear in its full glory before turning dark again. First, there was one, but it was almost immediately followed by another, then 2 more, 5 more, 10 more. More and more sparks of light poured out of the ship up like shooting stars, lighting up the void for fractions of seconds at a time, in a colourful spectacle that Nafmir Duralfriend could only truly compare to fireworks, rapid firing out of a pyrotechnics machine. However, in reality, they could only be one thing.
"They're sending out fighters,"
he announced loudly. It was unlikely that none of his officers had made the connection themselves yet, but it was important that he got everyone onto the same wavelength, quickly.
"Prepare ships for interception."
They didn't have long. Luckily, the order guards were protecting them. Otherwise, it may have already been too late.
"Shooting out their fighters through hyperspace,"
he mumbled to himself once things were set into motion, for his own ships to engage the incoming crafts, figuring that the flagship must have rapid-fire generated the small stretches for the fighters to inject into so they wouldn't be vulnerable as they emerged from their hangars, and also so they would reach their targets of attack much, much faster. Almost stupidly daring, but clever. Very clever. However, thanks to some quick thinking, it would ultimately be pointless. Their targets were protected from them right now, and once the protective bubble fell, they would have to deal with his own fighters. And that was a fight that even the humans weren't going to win, even if the numbers were on their side. It was still peculiar to see these new models of fighters as they emerged from his ship and into the view of his cameras. They were comparatively small and round, and in each direction an extremely long spike stuck out of their hull, much longer than the ships themselves were. It really was a good thing that one didn't have to worry about aerodynamics in space, otherwise the design would have looked even more utterly foolish than it already appeared. However, there was method to the madness, as their foes on the battlefield would soon find. The fighters flew in a widespread formation, leaving a lot of room between each of them, as they positioned themselves along the corners of the generated grid of cubes that space had been divided into by their computers. And once they had reached their place in the formation, the long spikes began to show their purpose, as their ends activated and erupted in the Order Guard's hazy energy, forming a protective network of spears around them, just like the one that had just temporarily protected their motherships, just on a much smaller and more manageable scale. The ship itself was then situated in a small empty space in the middle between the spheres. The spikes were made of a durable and very conductive alloy, specifically designed to withstand the extreme energy output on a small scale as the emerging spheres protected the ships, leaving them nigh invulnerable to enemy fighter attacks. The humans may have been valiant warriors, but this was not a conflict they were going to win. "Keep pushing the fighters with more shots," he ordered, knowing it would be bad if he gave the small fighter craft swarming around his ships the chance to freely use their numbers to their advantage too much. Luckily, the Order Guard's wide sphere of effectiveness was quite effective when it came to pressuring small craft specifically, as they would have to divert whatever they were doing to get out of the way of the massive projectiles. If they were caught lacking, there was a good chance a whole group of them would even get inevitably caught in the path of one. "Yes, sir," his gunner replied, the enthusiasm in his voice not wavering one bit. It seemed that he was eager to shoot a couple of the primates out of the sky. The protective bubble of their 5 projectiles now gradually dispersed, as they flew too far apart for their spheres to still interlock with each other, leaving the stage open for the fighters to engage with each other. Despite their reduced size, one of these Zodiatos ships was easily thrice the size of a human vessel, even when not counting the enormous shield that surrounded them. This made the human ships a good bit faster and more maneuverable. However, his own fighters had the advantage that they could comfortably pursue human ships in close combat, as any contact with their shields would be utterly devastating for such small vessels, and the chance of retaliation against the shield was absolutely minimal. And then there was of course the supporting Order Guard fire from the larger ships, something that the humans had to worry about a lot more than the Zodiatos with their own shields. Soon enough, the barely visible human fighters pushed into the gaps between the drifting apart spheres, like shadows creeping under a door. However, Nafmir Duralfriend's own loyal pilots were already awaiting them there. In the corner of his eye, he also saw his ever-motivated gunner get a glint in his eyes, as he realized just how splendid of a funnel the Order Guards had formed for the human ships, leaving many of them to fly in what may as well have been in single file, with a lot of momentum carrying them right in the direction of his cannons. A dream shot for an artilleryman, if Nafmir Duralfriend had ever seen one, and the young man was clearly not going to miss it. As the ship shook ever so slightly as the youngster took the shot, Nafmir Duralfriend looked upon the visual broadcast of the engagement. Just how would the humans react to such a foe like they had never faced before? At the very least, he could respect that they were facing it head-on. Some simple fire was exchanged as soon as the combatants laid eyes on each other, and the result was expectedly one-sided. The human ships were forced to swivel and swerve in evasive maneuvers to avoid the shots, while their own projectiles and explosives simply fizzled against the Zodiatos' shields. In his head, Nafmir Duralfriend remembered a very old saying that he had once been told while visiting a museum that told of combat. When given the choice between the axe and the shield, the wise warrior will always choose the shield. For a very long time in their modern world of spatial warfare, that choice had never existed, so everyone had run around looking to find the biggest and sharpest axe to beat the others out with it. But now the rules had changed, and once again, the wise warriors had gone for the shield. After their pilots had received the message of the incoming fire support, as well as its travel path along the grid, their formation burst apart and reformed in an even wider arch that ultimately resembled a slowly closing moor around the human fighters. With the Order Guard on its way, the pilots began herding as many of their Deathworld opponents into its path as possible, while blocking their possible routes of escape with weapons fire, as well as their very own shields, forming a very hard-to-escape funnel net to catch these flies in. Meanwhile, many of their possible ways to back out were still blocked by the previous volley of Order Guards that gradually drifted out into space. All his ships had to do now was to keep up their formation and fire at any humans trying to escape the trap and making themselves an easy target. The rest would be handled by the heavy weaponry. "Remember to keep a barrier between us and the largest ships," he once again reminded his soldiers, still not eager to be on the receiving end of one of their shots. Though still, his attention was mostly drawn to the human fighters. He was still curious how they would try to deal with that... this kind of opponent. After all, there would be a lot to learn from their reaction to facing an unknown force, even if their chances of victory were slim. They must have realized by now that they were drawn into a trap. He was sure of it. They didn't seem like the kind to not notice it. But knowing one had walked into a trap only mattered if one knew how to escape it. Would they make a break for it? Maybe try to sacrifice some while letting a larger part escape? "Show me your trunk, humans," he mumbled silently as he observed. And the humans indeed turned from their current course, though to his surprise they didn't actually fly a curve at all. Instead, they seemed to shut off most of their engines for a moment, only using some front thrusters to turn themselves away from their current direction, while still being carried onward by their own momentum. Like that, they drifted along for a moment, turning in their motion to face their opposing fighters head-on. "A last stand?" Nafmir Drawfriend wondered quietly to himself, seeing just how much of their speed the human ships had sacrificed in that slow turn. Even if they still had some momentum, it would be a very close call for them to speed up enough to avoid the incoming Order Guard that they had to know was coming by now. And that wasn't even mentioning how open they were leaving themselves to fire from the Zodiatos fighters with speed this low. Might they be throwing everything they had at their opponents in a last blaze of glory? Consequences be damned? Though, with an interested tilt of his head and a slight lift of his trunk, Nafmir Drawfriend realized after a brief moment that the humans' drifting wasn't quite as uncontrolled as he had figured, because once they had reached the angle that they seemingly desired and stopped their turning momentum, he noticed that the human fighter vessels were now drifting in rows of three, always two ships lining up behind one leading closest to the outside barricade of his forces, and each ship in one row was just ever so slightly offset from the ones in front of it, so that they didn't quite form a perfect line. Clearly there was method to it. By now, the newly fired Order Guard heading right down the funnel was growing to a size that threatened this newly formed human formation, also slowly blocking the sight of it from Nafmir Drawfriend. By now, it was probably too late for them to get out of the way after they did whatever they were planning there. A blaze of glory it was. In the corner of his eyes, there was a bit of movement catching his attention all of a sudden. On one of his other screens, the sensors were once again going wild. "Hyperspace detected!" his officer yelled out as her head snapped up, her posture stiffening severely as he watched the same thing unfold as Nafmir Drawfriend himself witnessed. The detected signatures were incredibly different from the ones that typical, stable hyperspace meant for travel exuded. They knew the humans possessed this technology, of course. Now it was time to see how their axe would stack up against his shield. "Have at thee," he mumbled, as the apes took their last stand. His direct sight of the small ships was already taken away by the expanding sphere of energy heading towards their destruction at this point. However, He didn't need to see them to know what was happening right there. Especially not as the rainbow-coloured flashes shot out from their obscure position, just before the deadly spear would make contact with the first of the fighters. Oh, how he wondered if the shots were going to penetrate. So much so that he dared not look away, even as the bright flashing lights burned themselves into his eyes in a brief vision of infinity. Of course, everything happened so incredibly, unthinkably fast that what truly occurred was only comprehensible after the fact, as everything moved faster than the thought could even be formed, as even a single firing of a synapse occurred almost indefinitely slow in comparison to the action itself. Faster than thought, faster than light, faster than even the universe itself could react. He saw the large explosion as enormous quantities of energy erupted outwards from the impact, as shots indeed connected with the shields, but something was wrong. His subconscious knew it long before any reasoned thought could be formed, as the picture was burned into his eyes, but something was wrong. There were more lines now. More lines than the ones that had shot outwards from the ships, and the shots had come from the wrong direction. He never got to satisfy his lust to know whether the shields could withstand a shot of those weapons, as far more than just one hammered into the backs of each individual ship, battering them down with an unloading of energy. There was too much for pretty much anything to withstand on such a small scale. And as soon as the ships were burst open, even more shots hammered the ships on the inside, obliterating them in fiery balls that were contained by the remaining still active shield generators for just a moment before those lost power as well, and left the brightly glowing superheated remains to float in place as temporary miniature suns. Nafmir Duralfriend's eye shot around to the sensors. They had been flanked by a so far unseen regiment? Where did those ships come from? Another one of the surrounding funnels must have been breached. However, that wasn't the case, because at all of the other open corners and gaps of their dispersing temporary shields, it seemed like this exact phenomenon was occurring at the same time. But if the other fronts were also only broken now, then where did those... Suddenly, something zapped past his camera with a bright glow, leaving an afterglow in his eye. And then there was another, then 10 more. Soon enough, he had to avert his eyes as the screen stopped showing him the darkness of space with the occasional light, and it was instead filled with a brightly glowing web of lines. No, not lines. Stretches. Hyperspace stretches. Multiple dozens of them. All of them dispersing as soon as they appeared, only to be near immediately replaced by another one. The entire void all around the Zodiatos ship became light from the sparkling stretches, outshining even the system's nearby star. Meanwhile, all of the sensors that could even remotely detect a stretch went absolutely haywire. Was each of the fighters... One of the stretches then dispersed right in their view, leaving the black ship that emerged from it standing out in amazing contrast from the bright background with its near true black colour. The ship drifted there for less than the blink of an eye, only just long enough to fire off a single shot of its physics-defying weaponry, before it immediately disappeared in yet another flash of light. A strong tremor suddenly shook the ship so heavily that the ground was momentarily pulled out from under Nafim Duralfriend's feet. Reacting quickly, he managed to land back on all fours again, even if the sudden unwanted jump caused some jolting pain in his ankles as he landed. Some of his officers weren't so lucky and toppled over where they stood, grunting out in pain as their massive bodies hit the ground. Grimacing against the pain and wrapping his trunk firmly around a nearby railing to anchor himself, Nafmir Duralfriend didn't need the ship's blaring alarms to tell him that they had suffered a hit. A brief glimpse at the diagnostics on his screen told him that their engines had been struck. The shot must have come from right behind them, from the inside of their ship's formation. They had just flown past them, right through their formation. The scene replayed before his inner eye. A hyperspace jump that was nowhere near far enough to justify using such an engine. A brief emergence to fire a shot, and then an immediate retreat back into hyperspace. Repeated, all around him. Who knew how many times each second? They could generate it that fast, and not for a moment did they appear so much as disoriented. He was out of it for a moment, just staring wide-eyed. But then he let go of the railing again, as his trunk found its way to his scare once more, grounding him. He let out a long exhale. "Well, old friend," he said to himself, as he felt scar tissue rub along scar tissue, once again thinking back to the day that he had received this injury. "Guess things are going as planned after all." 1212 AD. A message reached Shida's ear, causing it to slightly twitch as the voice talked right into it through the strapped-on headphones that wrapped around her head. "I'm aware. Thanks, DF," she replied through the comm herself, having already noticed the ship as soon as she had emerged back in normal space. The thing was huge, and almost entirely obscured by whatever that weird, opaque stuff was that these things generated. As it noticed that she had emerged so closely to it, it seemed to see its best chance at getting her by accelerating to ramming speed. Shida pulled at her steering a bit, but it was no use. With that massive undefined energy barreling towards her, she wouldn't have enough time to turn for a shot. Better cut her losses. Pulling the brake for a moment, she activated one of her forward's thrusters as she adjusted to the stated and predicted routes of her surrounding allies on the grid, so she wouldn't accidentally intercept with any of them as she jumped away. This caused her to drift sideways for a moment, which in turn caused the charging wall of energy to gain on her as she slowed down, while also allowing her a better view of it through her front window. She turned her head to the side a bit and adjusted the goggles over her eyes slightly, as the ball of hazy death headed right for her broadside, becoming exponentially larger to her eyes by the second. She delayed her jump a smidge just to look at it a moment longer. It was almost beautiful in a strange way. So strange. So alien. However, before she could get into serious trouble, in case the pilot of that thing decided to actually pull the trigger instead of just rushing her, she hit the engines and jumped out of there. It was like blinking. For half a heartbeat, everything outside of her windows went entirely black. Then, she was already in another place, still drifting sideways the same way she had done before the jump. Only now, the nose of her ship was pointed right at a target that way. As she pulled the trigger, her brightly glittering shot flew right past one of those burning orbs that the enemy fighters were turning into whenever their destruction was contained by their own shields. But unlike a real star, these miniature versions were by far not enough to make her shot curve and pull away from its target, meaning that it crashed right into the fighter's shield. Those things were impressive. A direct hit with a relativity cannon, and yet the fighter was still going. Those shields were tough as boars. Though, it seemed they could only pull that trick off one time before they had to regenerate, as the rear shield burst apart with the hit of her weapon, dispersing the energy of the impact all around, leaving the ship wide open for another shot from this angle. Still, if these things could tank a relativity shot, even if it was just a small one from an unkindness class, there couldn't be much else that could get through those shields. Just what was that strange haze? AD! Another comm sounded into her ear. However, she was already in the process of hitting the engines. "I got it," she said, as she jumped again, quickly flashing out of the way of an incoming rocket. As she reappeared in normal space, she could sense the explosion of the thing go off far in the distance, within the corner of her vision, not even seconds away from actually hitting her ship, had she not moved. Say what you will, but these bastards were persistent.